This war is not just about territory or borders, it is about the very soul of a nation, and the anxieties that have haunted this region for generations. To understand why Russia fights, we must look beneath the headlines, into history, identity, and fear. The roots of this conflict stretch deep into the past, shaped by centuries of shifting empires, revolutions, and the scars of war. For the Kremlin, this is about Russia's survival as a great power, and reclaiming what it sees as its rightful sphere of influence. Leaders in Moscow believe that without a buffer of loyal neighbors, Russia itself is exposed and vulnerable. The conflict in Ukraine is a clash of two worldviews, sovereign nations choosing their own paths, seeking freedom and self-determination, versus great powers dominating their neighbors, imposing their will through force or fear. It is a struggle between the right to independence and the desire for control. Russia's actions are driven by a deep conviction that it is defending itself from an encroaching West, rooted in centuries of invasions and a sense of vulnerability. Memories of Napoleon's armies, Hitler's tanks, and the devastation of war are never far from the Russian mind. A Western-aligned Ukraine is seen in Moscow as an existential threat, not just a lost ally. The idea of NATO on Russia's doorstep stirs old fears and new insecurities. The trauma of the Soviet collapse and perceived betrayals still shape decisions in Moscow today. The 1990s brought economic chaos, lost prestige, and a sense of humiliation that lingers in the national psyche. This war is a desperate attempt to rewrite the end of the Cold War and secure Russia's place in the world on its own terms. It is about restoring lost pride and challenging a world order seen as unfair. The outcome will shape international rules for decades, testing alliances and the principle of sovereignty. The choices made now will echo far beyond Eastern Europe. The conflict forces us to confront hard questions about security, power, and the price of peace. It reminds us that war is never just about armies, it is about people, families, and futures at risk. It shows how a single war can trigger global energy shortages, food crises, and instability. The shockwaves reach every corner of the world, affecting lives far from the battlefield. Understanding Russia's motives is essential for navigating this dangerous new era. Only by grasping the fears and ambitions that drive this conflict can we hope to find a path toward lasting peace. Russia's obsession with Ukraine is not a recent phenomenon. It stretches back over 1,000 years, deeply rooted in the shared and often contested history of the two nations. The story begins with the medieval state of Kievan Rus, a powerful federation that laid the foundations for both modern Russia and Ukraine. For many Russians, Kyiv, not Moscow, was the cradle of their civilization, the birthplace of their nation and Orthodox faith, forging a powerful emotional and spiritual bond that endures to this day. The idea of Ukraine turning toward the West is seen by many Russians as a profound betrayal, like a family member abandoning centuries of shared heritage, language, and culture. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 created a new border that many Russians never truly accepted, severing what they saw as deep, almost familial historical ties. Vladimir Putin has repeatedly called the loss of Ukraine a tragedy, framing its independence as a historical mistake that must be corrected for the sake of Russia's future. For the Kremlin, the fight for Ukraine is not just about territory, it's a struggle for Russia's soul, its identity, and its place in the world. Religion has only deepened this divide. The 2019 independence of Ukraine's Orthodox Church was seen in Moscow as a direct Western attack on Russian spiritual unity, further inflaming tensions. This religious schism fueled the sense among Russians that Ukraine was being stolen from their orbit, not just politically, but spiritually as well. Russian leaders now frame the war as a mission to reunite divided peoples, to right what they see as a historical wrong, and to restore a lost sense of unity. This narrative, though fiercely contested and rejected by Ukrainians, remains a powerful motivator inside Russia, shaping public opinion and fueling the ongoing conflict. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 was a shock for Russians, not a celebration. Russia was left weakened, impoverished, and diminished, with millions of ethnic Russians stranded in new countries. The 1990s brought chaos, hyperinflation, unemployment, and the rise of oligarchs, eroding national pride. The West was seen as a triumphant victor, imposing its will on a defeated Russia. This humiliation fueled resentment and a longing for a strong leader. Enter Vladimir Putin. Putin's mission: reverse the chaos, restore Russia's power, and reclaim influence over former Soviet republics. Ukraine, the largest and most strategic, became the focal point of this ambition. The war is an attempt to undo the post-Soviet order and force the world to recognize Russia's interests. For Moscow, it's about redrawing Europe's map and proving Russia is still a force to be reckoned with. The West sees NATO as a defensive alliance. Russia sees it as a threat creeping ever closer. Since 1999, 14 former Soviet bloc countries have joined NATO, which Moscow views as encirclement. The 2008 promise of NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia was Russia's red line. Russian leaders felt betrayed by what they saw as broken promises that NATO would not expand eastward. Every new NATO base is seen as proof of hostile intent, deepening distrust of the West. For Russia, NATO is not just military hardware. It's a vehicle for Western values that threaten the Kremlin's grip on power. A democratic, Western-aligned Ukraine could inspire Russians to demand change at home. Stopping NATO's advance is about both national security and regime survival. The fear of encirclement shapes every Russian move. This is the lens through which Moscow views the world. Russia claims its war in Ukraine is defensive, about demilitarization, denazification, and protecting Russian speakers. This narrative rallies domestic support, painting Russia as a victim forced to act. But beneath the slogans lie deeper motives, preventing a successful democratic Ukraine that could inspire Russians to seek change. Destabilizing Ukraine keeps it from becoming a model of freedom and prosperity on Russia's border. Control over energy is another factor. Ukraine's pipelines and gas reserves are strategic assets. The war is also about economic leverage over Europe. The invasion was based on a massive miscalculation. Moscow expected a quick victory and underestimated Ukrainian resistance. Instead, Russia faces a long, costly quagmire. The official story hides a struggle for power, resources, and regime survival. The war has devastated Ukraine and hurt Russia, but it's also created winners. The West has weakened Russia's military and economy without direct intervention, uniting NATO. Russia profits from high energy prices, selling oil and gas to China, India, and Turkey. The war has tightened Putin's grip at home, rallying the population against the West. China benefits most, buying cheap Russian energy and watching its rivals exhaust resources. Despite sanctions, economic ties persist. Russia still supplies uranium and strategic minerals to the West. The conflict reveals a world where confrontation and cooperation coexist in a tangled web. The war's shockwaves threaten other nations, especially Moldova and Georgia. Moldova, with its breakaway region Transnistria and Russian troops, is vulnerable to intervention. Georgia, scarred by Russia's 2008 invasion, fears renewed conflict as it seeks closer ties with the West. Even NATO members like the Baltics face Russian hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, disinformation, and energy blackmail. Russia's modern tactics aim to destabilize without direct invasion, exploiting vulnerabilities from within. The front line is now in cyberspace, media, and politics, not just on maps. For Russia's neighbors, the threat is constant and evolving. The message, even with NATO, no one is truly safe from Russian influence. Isolated by the West, Russia has built new alliances based on shared opposition to the US-led order. Belarus is Russia's closest partner, providing a launchpad for the war in exchange for economic and political support. Russia turns to Iran for drones and North Korea for artillery, trading technology and resources in return. China is Russia's most important partner, buying energy, amplifying propaganda, and offering diplomatic cover. But Russia is now the junior partner, increasingly dependent on Beijing. This coalition is pragmatic, not ideological, united by anti-Western interests. These alliances help Russia bypass sanctions and sustain its war effort. But they come at a cost: deeper dependence and new geopolitical fault lines. The war is reshaping global alliances for years to come. Achieving peace in Ukraine remains as distant as ever, with negotiations repeatedly stalling over fundamental issues of territory, sovereignty, and a deep lack of trust between the parties. Each attempt at dialogue seems to reveal new obstacles, making the path forward even more complicated. Russia continues to demand international recognition of its annexations, insisting that these territories are now an inseparable part of its nation. Meanwhile, Ukraine remains steadfast, insisting on the restoration of its 1991 borders and the return of all occupied regions, refusing to accept any compromise on its territorial integrity. Years of brutal conflict, shattered cities and broken promises have left both sides deeply distrustful, with civilians bearing the brunt of the ongoing violence and uncertainty. Domestic pressures on both governments make any form of compromise politically dangerous. Leaders fear being seen as weak or betraying national interests, while public opinion remains sharply divided. In August 2025, a rare breakthrough occurred. Russia agreed to allow Western nations to offer Ukraine security guarantees in exchange for a formal pledge that Ukraine would not seek NATO membership, a key Russian demand that had long been a sticking point. Russia also made a public promise not to attack other European countries, aiming to ease fears of further aggression and to reassure neighboring states. These steps created a new framework for diplomatic talks, raising cautious hopes for a more stable future. Yet the most difficult issues, territory and mutual trust, remain unresolved, casting a long shadow over any progress. The recent agreement marks progress, but it is far from a comprehensive solution. Many challenges and unanswered questions still lie ahead. The stakes could not be higher. The future of the global order and the security of Europe itself hang in the balance, watched closely by the entire world. To truly understand the conflict, one must look at its deep historical roots, the complex web of competing interests, and the powerful forces shaping both nations' destinies. Only by confronting these difficult realities and engaging in honest dialogue can the world hope to achieve a lasting and meaningful peace. The path forward is uncertain and filled with obstacles, but the search for stability, security, and hope continues for all those affected.